Hello. Today I want to share a couple things with you today. I want to share with you a copy of the Book of Mormon. That's kind of rare. And I want to talk to you about St. John, Kansas, and the importance that St. John, Kansas has in church history today. Well, first of all, what I want to mention is back in about 1899, the Whitmerites, they did their publication of the Book of Mormon. It's retranslated. It's just like the Community of Christ retranslated the Book of Mormon in 1908. So the Whitmerites had a translation of the Book of Mormon, the RLDS Church had a translation of the Book of Mormon, and the LDS Church has a translation of the Book of Mormon. And they're slightly different, basically the same thing, but slightly different. So I'm going to talk to you about that I'm going to show you an example of that here in a moment. So what happened was when the Whitmerite Church, when they did their print of the Book of Mormon in 1899, they called it the Nephite Record instead of the Book of Mormon. And then they did a second printing of it, and they called that the Nephite Record. And then they did a third printing of it. But they did something different this time. And this is really kind of interesting. There was an RLDS historian, Lewis E. Hills, and he did these brochures right here. These are done in 1915, 1917, 1918, right around there. And what happened was, in these brochures that are done, these small booklets, it has history of the ancient Americas and the people of the Book of Mormon. And here you have Central America. So here's all these artifacts in these three books right here. These aren't, it's hard to find these. These are fairly rare, these books right here. And they're Hill's books on Central America, history of the Book of Mormon. So what happened was, the Whitmerites asked Hills if they can print their maps and illustrations printed into their Nephite Record, their Book of Mormon. And he said yes. So what happened was, in about 1920, there was a printing of the Book of Mormon by the Whitmerite Church, and they did not call it the Nephite Record. What they called it was the Stick of Joseph. They changed the name to Stick of Joseph to indicate that's where the Lewis Hills documentation's in. Now, the thing is, I've talked to a lot of people in the Community of Christ and different Restoration churches, historians in the Latter-day Saint Church, and big collectors that have hundreds and hundreds of copies of the Book of Mormon, and they refer to the Stick of Joseph as the unicorn of the Book of Mormon collectors. The unicorn collect Book of Mormon because everyone knows it exists, but no one's ever seen one. They're that rare. No one's ever seen one. So what I want to do today is share with you my copy of the Stick of Joseph. And the Stick of Joseph will have in it maps and illustrations that are in, just like you saw in that brochure, they're also in the Book of Mormon here also. And it also has your title page, and it also has the person who owned it back in the 1920s. Okay, so that is the Stick of Joseph. So it's a pretty rare copy of the Book of Mormon. Also, so this Stick of Joseph, the printing of it is probably around 1920. There's no date, a printing date in it, so it's about 1920. Now, I have different Book of Mormons, and just one that I really like. A lot of you may have heard of before, but we do have the Deseret Alphabet Book of Mormon, and this was done in 1869. And what you have is you have the key right here to the language, and you can see this is original 1869, and you can see that the book is written in a different language. And what happened was, Brigham Young's secretary made this language so that when people came to Salt Lake City from all over the world, Brigham Young didn't want the German part of Salt Lake, the Italian part of Salt Lake. They didn't want it divided. They wanted everyone together as members of the church. So you can learn this language in a few months, and over a year or two, wean you over to English, and everyone's members of the church. So it's an interesting copy of the Book of Mormon. Not that rare, but a lot of people don't really don't know about it very much. But I'm going to show you something else I think is really interesting. This book right here is basically a history of the Missouri Independence Mission. And this is the old mission office. When I served my mission here 40 years ago, that was our mission office. This is just down the street right here is the temple lot in Independence. But in the beginning of this book, it talks about the first members of the church that come to Independence. And what happened was the church did not initially come to Independence right away. But what they did was in 1885, 1883 and 85, you have President Kimball's father, Elder Andrew Kimball. He was the second mission president of the Indian Territory Mission in St. John, Kansas. So what that is in the middle of Kansas, almost all the way down. St. John's a small little town. And in that town, that's where the church started the missions for the Midwest area. And what happened was in St. John, Kansas, here's a picture of an old photograph of the chapel that President Kimball's father dedicated and built. Now, this building, as I was told, was long gone. But so what I did was I drove down 4.5 hours to St. John, Kansas to find the piece of land that was on there. I just wanted to see where it was. And I was looking for it, and I was talking around town, and the city chamber office says I should call this guy, and I called the guy. He says, well, let's go meet at the church. And the church is still there. It was really interesting. He was the last Bickertonite to be in St. John's. What happens is you had the Mormon church and the Bickertonite church both existed together in St. John at this time. So when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints left St. John, Kansas and came to Independence around 1900, they abandoned this building, or basically sold it to the Bickertonites. And that's when you had the Duffin brothers right here. They basically were like the bishop. And they sold the building to the Bickertonites. So when I went there, he took me a tour through the church. They still use it, even though he's the only one. And but there are still some Bickertonites in Pennsylvania, in the thousands. But he's the last one there. And there's some really cool stories about the Bickertons and the Mormons all being in St. John, Kansas. But what happened was they left and came to Independence. Now, something interesting about that, when the building was built, when I went there, the individual, he was nice enough that he gave me a nail that was used to build, with President Kimball's father, what they used to build the church with. And what happened was they had some foundation problems a few years back, so they had to pour some concrete and they had to take part of the wall out. And when they did that, over here, I have foundation stones to the St. John chapel that was used by President Kimball's father. And there was another building there that they also used as the mission headquarters, but that was the church coming out to the Midwest for the first time. And there's another rock from the foundation, and these bricks right here were bricks that came from the steeple that fell off the chapel, and they just didn't rebuild it. They didn't do that. Which brings me to something very, very important. When you think about Haun's Mill, there's very, very few artifacts from the event of Haun's Mill. Yeah, there's a millstone that was in the river that's in Salt Lake and a few other things like that, but there's really not that many things from Haun's Mill. And what happened was, 2 years after the massacre at Haun's Mill, the mill itself was sold to a local landowner, a family, and not a member of the church. And the bottom of the mill was made out of stone, the top was wood. So he was building a house, and this is all documented in land purchase records and journals. They took the stones, cut stones from the mill, and they built the foundation to their house. That house burned down. They built a second house out of the same stones, and they had 36 of them left over. And for years and years, historians, members of the church, Missouri historians, have asked this farmer if he could
if they could have some of the stones from the Hans mill. He always refused. He never let anybody have any. But he passed away. I went to his estate sale, and I bought all 36 of them. So here we have one of the cut stones from the Hans mill.